Welcome to the NFL Fantasy Football Show, presented by DraftKings. Here's your host, Marcas Grant.
What is up? Welcome to another edition of the NFL Fantasy Football Show, presented by DraftKings. It's me, your man, MG Marcas Grant, still masking and socially distancing when and where necessary. And welcome to another Friday show. We have begun week 10. We will talk about it, though, in full with our own Michael F Florio. That means we will talk about some of the best value draft picks that we expect for this week. For those of you playing daily fantasy football, we'll talk to our resident nerd, Matt Okada, who, by the way, did an excellent guest turn sitting in for Adam Rank on Wednesday. We'll also look at the Thursday night football game between the Colts and the Titans. Some interesting questions coming out of that one. We got that and plenty more to talk about on today's show. But as we always do at this time, we'll talk to our faithful producer, Senior Edward L. Murphy, Esquire. And Murph, we were talking before the show about The Mandalorian, and this has been, I know we're 2 episodes into the season, but it has reminded me why it literally is probably one of the best shows on TV right now.
Without a doubt. You have the child / Baby Yoda, whatever you want to call him, is like one of the biggest stars in TV. And you're still trying to see like what is the purpose of that character. And then, it's just a really, really well done show. There's so many talented people who are behind that, whether it's the directing or the creators of the show, Jon Favreau, obviously, mainly. But the second episode was definitely a bridge episode. I'm interested to see and what they're going to do with that storyline. But it's so good. And the thing that stinks, like we were talking before, is we have to wait a week in between. Like, I'm not sure if I want to binge it all in once, because I would. If it was out, I'd watch it all in a day, and I'd do nothing with my life and just sit on the couch and watch it, because that's how good it is. But they want to make us wait and talk about it, which is cool. We are in the golden age of TV, I believe. So it's just another excellent show, at our disposal.
I will say that, in the whole Star Wars universe, I feel like they have done a better job recently of telling stories outside of the main character arc, right? We followed the whole Skywalker saga forever, and it was fine. Like, we all loved it. But I feel like recently between The Mandalorian, Rogue One, what have you, I feel like they've done a better job once they get outside the main arc and start talking about some of those other stories in the universe.
Absolutely. And like I was mentioning to you, they do like behind the scenes stuff after the show, and you could watch it. And the people who create the show are so into Star Wars and the Star Wars universe. And like, I love that when people who are basically nerds at their craft and they love every single story. And like, we're all used to like the Luke Skywalker storyline, but there's so many extra things out there that they're now bringing into Mandalorian. And it's awesome, because there's more to the Star Wars universe that the regular average person may not know about it. So it's great to see all the different aspects they bring in, because like I said, it's an exciting show. It's a fun show. You really fall in love with the characters. I really can't ask for much more.
Absolutely. So looking forward to that. It has become my Friday night thing. When everybody else goes to bed, I stay up late. I watch The Mandalorian. So I'm looking forward to that capping out what should be a pretty good Friday. Absolutely. All right, let's turn our attention now to our pal Michael F Florio, who joins us every Friday to talk fantasy football and kind of go through the week as it is. Are you watching The Mandalorian? I should ask. Are you watching it?
I haven't started it yet. It's on, I haven't even watched season 1 yet. It's on my list. I actually recently, during quarantine, got my fiance for the first time to watch the original Star Wars trilogy. So making progress. I'm trying to get her now to watch The Mandalorian with me.
All right, no, that's good. But at least at least now when you start watching it, she'll have some background, so it sort of will make sense, and so she'll understand why people are going nuts over this tiny little green character that's floating around in an orb. So like that, it's a good way to start. So tell her welcome to the family. She's one of us now.
I'll let her know.
All right. Let's look back at the Thursday night football game from last night. It ended up being one-sided when it was all said and done. The Colts ran off to a 34-17 win over the Titans. In actual football perspective, now the Colts are sitting on top of the AFC South in what should be a very competitive race coming down to the end. But let's look at it from a fantasy perspective. Some of the top scores from last night: Nyheim Hines, obviously the big star of the night, 115 scrimmage yards, 5 catches, 2 touchdowns in that one. Michael Pittman with 122 scrimmage yards and 7 catches. Phillip Rivers, an okay night, 300 passing yards, a touchdown. Derrick Henry never found the end zone, but yardage-wise, a pretty good night, 103 on the ground, 1 catch for 6 yards. So not quite 12 points. The touchdown would have probably put it over the top, but pretty good production for Henry in that one. Normally, when we do these, Mike, I like to ask questions about both teams, but I feel like we didn't learn a ton about the Colts last night. They were going up against good defense. I don't know that we're worried about A.J. Brown. I don't know that we're necessarily freaked out because Ryan Tannehill didn't have a good game against a good defense. So most of my questions about this game came on the Colts side of the football, and it starts with the guy I mentioned who was the star of the night, Nyheim Hines. Mike Clay of ESPN posted last night, which was very astute, I thought. Hines, when he scores touchdowns, he scores 2 in a game, right? He had 2. He's got 6 touchdowns on the year. They have come in pairs. Beyond that, he's not scoring touchdowns, but he looks like he's playing the best ball of anybody in that backfield. So are we officially on board now with Nyheim Hines in fantasy?
Officially on board in the sense of I think he should be rostered. I think he is the Colts running back that I am most likely to trust and to get into my fantasy lineup. But just look at his game log, right? Like week 1, 27.3. I actually, Marcus, after week 1, a friend in my league spent 75% of his fab budget on Nyheim Hines and then has already dropped him before these 2 of these last 3 big games he had. Like that is how Nyheim Hines' season is gone. Like after week 1, he had 1 game in double digits up until he had the 21 points a couple weeks ago and then the 28 last night. He's just so boomer bust that I think what Mike Clay said is true. Like he has 3 games with a touchdown this year, and each of those 3 games he scored twice. He's just so boomer bust in that range. Right now, I want to stay away from this entire backfield.
He is what my pal Matt Harmon refers to as a Costco player, right? He scores in bulk. All his points come in bulk, which makes it really hard to sort of project him. I'm with you. If there is a back to have in this Indianapolis backfield, it's probably Nyheim Hines, mostly because for me, his role doesn't change regardless of the situation. We know he is generally the pass catching back. When he's running well, like he did last night, then maybe he gets more touches as a running back. But generally speaking, his role is going to be kind of static, whereas the other 2 guys, Jordan Wilkins and Jonathan Taylor, they seem to be battling for who's going to be the actual running back of choice for Frank Reich's offense, which leads me to the next obvious question. It was another poor night for Jonathan Taylor, just about 35, 37 yards, scrimmage yards, all told for him. Was stood up at the goal line at one point in that ball game. Then late in the game, they're giving Jacoby Brissett goal line touches over Jonathan Taylor. Is he droppable at this point?
Maybe. I wouldn't. Like I have Jonathan Taylor in a few leagues, and I think it's blind hope at this point that is not allowing me to drop him. I can't consider starting him now going forward, even though next week is a favorable matchup. I don't see how I can start him right now. But I'm someone who coming into the year, I was very high on Jonathan Taylor. I thought after their bye week, they were going to really let him go because I thought, preseason led to, rookies struggling early on, but now he would be more acclimated and they'd really just start using him more. And it's been the exact opposite. Like he's getting outplayed by Nyheim Hines and Jordan Wilkins. And right now, Frank Reich is not saying anything at all that makes us think he's going to change it. In fact, he's saying the exact opposite. He's saying, I love having 3 running backs. Why wouldn't? And I get it from a real life perspective. Yeah, you want to have depth. You want to have the ability to make your offense a little bit tough to predict. But for fantasy, it is an absolute nightmare. And Jonathan Taylor, sadly, has been the least productive of the 3. And part of it, I tweeted this out last night, Marcus, right? Like a lot of us want to blame the usage as why Jonathan Taylor is not a good fantasy asset. Oh, the hot hand approach is hurting him. To me, the bigger problem is he's never the hot hand.
I think you're right. And look, I know we do. We want to just say, hey, why don't you just give him the ball more? But part of it is basically what you said. He's not playing well. So if you're Frank Reich, why would you keep banging your head against that wall and giving the ball to a guy who's not productive when you have other guys who are playing well right now? And like we said, it looks like, at least for the last 2 or 3 weeks, Nyheim Hines has been the best back in that offense. Jordan Wilkins has stepped in and he's played some really good football, so he's certainly worthy of some more opportunities. I'll say this, because I had Jonathan Taylor on one of my fantasy rosters, and I was basically leaving him on the bench at this point. Like I didn't feel comfortable putting him in. I was sort of like you, where I looked at that matchup against the Packers next week and thought, maybe I could do this. That worry has been taken out of my hands. Someone offered me Kareem Hunt for Jonathan Taylor, and I could not hit accept fast enough on that one. I was just sort of ready to be done with the headache. So I kind of moved on from that. But at this point, if you've got Jonathan Taylor, I don't know what you do. I mean, I think you're sort of stuck, right? Because he's still going to get touches. He's still going to get opportunities. You hope maybe he makes the best of them. Otherwise, I think he's going to be sort of hard to trade, because I think everybody sees what happened last night, and it's going to be hard to sort of figure out what to do with him. Elsewhere in that Colts offense, like I said, I didn't have any real questions about the Titans. I mostly had questions about the Colts. Michael Pittman had the big game receiving last night for Indianapolis, but we know Zach Pascal is still there. There's still a ton of tight ends, and that's a whole other ball of wax to try to figure out. But what is your interest level in any of the Colts receivers at this point?
Right now, my interest level is trying to pick up Michael Pittman off the waiver wire. Like, we'll have to see this week how it plays out, where he ranks amongst the waiver wire wide receivers. But after Thursday night, he is clearly someone that deserves to be picked up, I think, next week when waivers run. But outside of that, man, this Colts team has been... I know they're 6-3 in real life, but for fantasy, it is just a nightmare. Like, I want no part of T.Y. Hilton. Zach Pascal, he plays well. He gives you 10 fantasy points, you know? Like, the tight ends, like you said, they use their tight ends like they're running backs. They use 3 different tight ends. It is just so frustrating that this offense, while, like, Philip, and even Philip Rivers, right? Like, he throws for 300 yards last night. You're like, maybe he could put up some good fantasy numbers. Doesn't even give you 17 fantasy points. Like, this is just a gross offense for fantasy.
It's incredibly gross. I side with Pittman, partially because I'm being a Trojan homer, but also because he's sort of he's the young new option kind of there. And the last couple of weeks, it looks like Indy has been focused on trying to get him more involved in the offense. I think at this point, if you haven't already sort of washed your hands of T.Y. Hilton, I think you can go on and do that at this point, because he's shown nothing to suggest that any real consistency is coming from him. I think Zach Pascal might still have some big breakout games somewhere in there, but you're right. This is an offense that at this point, there's nothing encouraging or exciting about it. And even the one piece in Taylor that we thought could be something really to hold on to just has let us down. So it's amazing that this team can be so competitive and so good in real football and offer us absolutely nothing, or at least next to nothing, in fantasy football. All right, so now we'll turn our attention to a couple of fantasy headlines, and these two fantasy headlines have some similar things in common. We will start in Los Angeles with the Chargers, where, according to offensive coordinator Shane Steichen, this backfield will be determined by, quote, the flow of the game, which is basically just another way of saying we're going with a hot hand in this one, which, again, makes our stomachs turn as a collective fantasy populace. But is there any Chargers running back this week in the game against the Dolphins that we can lean on? Assuming, it looks like Justin Jackson may not play, so that leaves us with Joshua Kelly, Kalen Ballage, maybe Troy Maine Pope if he's available. Any of those guys do anything for you this week?
Short answer, no. Long answer, if you are desperate for a running back, like I know that there's 4 teams on bye, injuries are really piling up, so you may be in need of grabbing someone off the waiver wire and plugging into your lineup. And if that's the case, I would go with Pope, because 2 weeks ago when he was healthy before he got the concussion, he was the pass catching back. He was the one playing that Austin Eckler original role, that Justin Jackson role. And to me, there's some fantasy value in that, because a target on average is like 3 times as valuable in PPR leagues as a carry. And that's where I think Kelly and Ballage will get a lot of work on the ground. But I don't feel comfortable saying like, oh, it's going to be Ballage, it's going to be Kelly, because Kelly has struggled all year, but he hasn't fully gone away. Like, they keep using him as that change of pace, like secondary running back. And it took Pope being out and Jackson being out to get Ballage into it. I think, right, this is a backfield to avoid, but if you're going a little bit deeper, I think it's Pope.
I know for me, it's definitely not Kelly, because after the first couple weeks of the season, we just haven't seen much from him, even though he's playing a lot of the snaps you see on the screen there. He played 52% of the snaps in week 9. Part of me wants to go with Kalen Ballage just because there's novelty in it, because he played so well last week that you hope maybe he continues to get some opportunity. Part of it is also maybe the revenge game factor going against it. So you may be right. It may be Pope because he's the guy who's been there, and however much stock you put in the phrase, he knows the system. I mean, Troy Maine Pope sort of knows the system there in Los Angeles. So maybe he is the answer. I feel like, though, we're both sort of unified in the fact that it's probably not going to be Joshua Kelly this week against Miami, against the Dolphins there. So,
but Marcus,
go ahead.
Did you see Austin Eckler's post yesterday?
I did. I saw fantasy Twitter kind of getting excited. He posted, in case you missed it, Austin Eckler posted video of himself doing sprints. And I think that the comment was something to the effect of, "This is for all my fantasy owners. Hope you didn't drop me or who haven't dropped me yet. Basically keep the faith," sort of thing. So I know that got fantasy Twitter very excited. We don't know when he's coming back yet.
It doesn't sound like it's going to be anytime soon still, but hopefully.
Right. The Chargers have given us no indication of when he's coming back, but it is good to see him running. And I know that anybody who held on, who has kept the faith this long, you got to be excited to see Austin Eckler back out there and working on the field again. All right. Up to San Francisco, though. Raheem Mostert was ruled out pretty early in the week by Kyle Shanahan. They got a matchup against the Saints that it does not look favorable for the Niners as a whole. That backfield has become a nightmare to figure out as well. When we think it's going to be Jerick McKinnon, then it's turned out to be Jeff Wilson or other guys back there. Who is it now? I mean, who do you feel confident in? JaMycal Hasty? Is it him? Is it Jeff Wilson? Who is it that we feel confident with rolling in the Niner backfield?
Right now, I would go with McKinnon, and even him I have as like a low-end RB2. The reason I like him, like you said it, Marcus, it's a tough matchup against the Saints. They're really, really tough against the run, but McKinnon can at least contribute in the passing game, and last week he scored a goal line touch. Like that is big, and that is the usage that I at least was expecting Hasty to get when I was backing him last week. And Hasty is kind of like Jonathan Taylor, right? Like, he's gotten some opportunity, and when he's gotten it, he's done absolutely nothing with it. So it makes sense as to why the coaches are going in a different direction. I can't trust him after what he did last week in an even tougher matchup now. So I'm going to go with Jerick McKinnon if I use any of these backs.
He probably is the answer here. I think for me, the general answer is I think I'm backing away from this backfield as a whole. I guess McKinnon is over the tired legs that he had a couple of weeks ago that allowed
got a good night's sleep.
Yeah, I guess. That's sort of what allowed JaMycal Hasty into our lives a couple of weeks ago, but it appears that McKinnon is sort of back to being the rusher of record for Kyle Shanahan's offense. But I have a feeling that the game script may not allow for the Niners to run the football the way they would like. That Niners secondary is still beat up. I mean, the whole team is just riddled with injuries, and I expect that the Saints might not have too many problems moving the football, scoring points. So this could be a game that is in the quarterback's hands, and it just may not even matter which Niners running back you put in your lineup because they may not get a chance to touch the ball a whole lot. This is great. We're in week 10, and we're dealing with running back issues just in time for the playoffs. So this is fun for everybody. All right. Today's show is sponsored by DraftKings, the leader in one-day fantasy sports. DraftKings has millions of dollars in total prizes up for grabs this week. So download the DraftKings app and start using the code TEAM during sign-up to start feeling the sweat like never before. Eligibility restrictions apply. See DraftKings.com for details. We come back, we'll have some of our big questions of the week, like an AFC West showdown. Which quarterback do you like the most in that one? Stay tuned for more of the NFL Fantasy Football Show. Salute to Service is the NFL's year-round effort to honor, empower, and connect with our nation's service members, veterans, and their families through long-standing partnerships that support our military community. The NFL, its clubs, and players thank all of our armed forces in serving in the United States and around the world. Join the NFL in Salute to Service by visiting NFL.com/salute. All right, time for some of our big questions of the week as we rush headlong into the rest of week 10. We made it to the double-digit weeks. I mean, that is an accomplishment in and of itself. So let's start in Detroit, where we talked about running backs a lot in the last segment. Let's just kind of keep that theme rolling right now. We want DAndre Swift to be great. When the Lions give him opportunities, he's done pretty well with them. It just seems like for whatever reason, they don't want him to be great. This week, it's not a great matchup against Washington. And I'm going to see how many times I can say great in this segment before we just get to the end of it. What should we expect from DAndre Swift this week against the FT?
Yeah, first, DAndre Swift, I'm very thankful for him because as someone who liked Taylor Swift, Swift at least is coming through. I know the coach usage isn't the best, but he's not making me look as silly as Jonathan Taylor is. My expectations this week, though, I still have him as a top 20 running back, and so much of that, though, is because the state of the running back position right now. I would use him over the Niners and the Chargers backs like we were just talking about last segment, but it is a tough matchup against the Washington football team. The only thing I'll say is, while the fantasy production, he hasn't had a huge blow-up game in a couple weeks now, but he played over 60% of the snaps last week. He's still their pass-catching back, getting 5 targets on average each game. And then he has 2 games this year with less than 11 fantasy points. So that's a safe floor. And I think if they ever cut him loose, the upside is a lot higher.
I do like the floor, and I get where you're coming from with the state of running backs, especially this week. You look at the guys on a bye, right? You got Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Le'Veon Bell on a bye, Ezekiel Elliott, Todd Gurley, all those guys are off. So people are going to be in need of running backs this week. So, and now you have David Johnson. Looks like he may not play depending on his status in the concussion protocol this week. So you're going to need running backs. And for that reason, DAndre Swift is going to be a guy that is going to be plugged into a lot of lineups. I just am so frustrated with watching every single week and seeing him do things with the football in his hands. And then you look up and Adrian Peterson is still playing 40% of the snaps. Or last week we saw Kerryon Johnson starting to get back into the act and it turning into a 3-headed monster. It is, I fear, sort of turning into what we have seen in Indianapolis, what we have seen in Baltimore. And that is frustrating when, at least in this case, look, I get it in Indy, right? Jonathan Taylor's not being the guy that you thought he would be. So you're going to get some other guys in there. In Baltimore, they just like to run the football and they just want to try to diversify as much as possible. In Detroit, I don't get it because you have a guy who I think has been head and shoulders above everybody else. Yet for whatever reason, you keep taking your 35-year-old running back and running him into the back of your offensive line. That's one that I don't understand at all. Okay. In Tampa, last week we talked about what's going to happen with Antonio Brown stepping into the lineup, how he's going to fit in with Chris Godwin and Mike Evans. And we said, maybe this is a wait and see week against the Saints. Let's figure out how things go. And then the Bucs got punched in the mouth repeatedly. And I feel like last week was not a true indication of what this offense can do because they sort of had to abandon their game plan pretty early in this one. Now this week, they've got the Panthers who've been pretty tough against opposing passing games. Do you think we're going to get a better idea of the Bucs wide receiver group this week?
My fear is that their usage looks similar to last week's usage where it was Godwin 6 targets, Evans 6 targets, Gronk 6 targets, and AB 5 targets. And that is just a fantasy nightmare because 6 targets for a player like Evans and Godwin that were drafted to be wide receiver ones is just not getting the job done. But I think this week, I have Antonio Brown ranked ahead of Mike Evans. I actually feel better about Antonio Brown going forward than Mike Evans. Antonio Brown, especially this week, because last week, Antonio Brown was their deep threat. He led them in air yards. He led them in targets of 20-plus air yards. And the Panthers this year have allowed the second most receptions of 20-plus air yards. So I'm thinking he has a better chance of converting those deep shots. And if you're talking about someone getting 5-6 targets, you either need a long completion or a touchdown to really justify having that guy in your fantasy lineup.
This is, we don't talk about wide receiver committees, but this is probably turning into a wide receiver committee right now. I still sort of put my chips with Chris Godwin a little bit because I still think he's the top receiver. I do agree that AB is probably going to finish ahead of Mike Evans this week, because Evans, he's if there's such a thing as a goal line receiver, that's what Mike Evans has become this year, right? He's the guy that they like throwing it to when they're down near the end zone. And so that touchdown upside has sort of kept him afloat, because between the 20s, you just have not gotten much production out of him. I do think that they are still going to make a concerted effort to kind of get Antonio Brown comfortable in this offense. Gronk has sort of come to life in terms of targets. Last week, he didn't do much production-wise, but then again, really nobody did in Tampa. So there just have become a lot of people that you have to spread the football to. And again, this is one of those things that's great for real football. It is maddening for fantasy football because we like certainty. We like narrow passing games. We like those focused opportunities where we know there's going to be a guy or two guys that get 8 to 10 targets a week. And that just might not be the case with this passing game with all the guys that they have to throw to. We haven't even mentioned the fact that they still throw the football to Leonard Fournette and Ronald Jones occasionally. So some of those targets are still coming out of that pool as well. So it's just going to be frustrating, and I think at some point you just sort of you pick a guy, you plant your flag, and you roll with them, and you see how things are going to turn out, because at some point the wheel's going to land on him. You just might not be able to figure out when. Quarterback talk in the AFC West. Kind of an interesting matchup between the Broncos and the Raiders, with two quarterbacks that don't necessarily get a ton of love, but have been playing pretty well right now. Drew Lock versus Derek Carr. Who would you pick between the two of them this week?
I have them back-to-back in my rankings, but I have Derek Carr just ahead. And kudos to you, Marcus. You were the first person that I heard at least talking up Drew Lock. Not even for the matchup against the Falcons, but you were talking about weeks ago, like, hey, this guy has a favorable schedule. And I think once again this week, he is a good streaming option. The only reason I will go with Derek Carr is because I think he's a little bit safer. Drew Lock, the last 2 weeks has been awesome, but before that, he was not someone you could really rely on for fantasy. And last week, the first half, I was nervous. I was like, oh man, Drew Lock is going to flop here. But then he was down 3 scores and had to throw, had to run, and really put up a nice day. But here, I like Derek Carr. He's just been consistent, as you see there. 2+ passing touchdowns in 6 of his last 7. He's getting a little bit more involved running the football. So I have them both as high-end QB2s, but if I have to pick one, I'm going Carr.
I'm going to go with Derek Carr here as well. And I think part of it is just at some point we got to give him his props, because he's very quietly been playing well this year. He has made something out of Nelson Aguilar, or maybe Nelson Aguilar has made something out of Derek Carr. I don't know. Maybe it's a partnership. I don't know. But for whatever reason, both these guys are playing really good football right now. The other part of it is, as much as I have been a champion for Drew Lock, it has been a little nerve-wracking to sort of watch him, because even in the games he's played well, those points haven't really shown up until the fourth quarter, and that's a hard way to live on a regular basis. I will say this: if you are going the Drew Lock streaming route, this might be your last week to sort of get in, because the schedule gets tougher for the next few weeks after this. They've got Miami, who has been locking down on quarterbacks, no pun intended there, the Saints, the Chiefs, the Panthers, the Bills. So for the next few weeks, things get a little bit tougher for Drew Lock. So if you have him on your roster and you're thinking about streaming a quarterback, this might be the last week to get in. Because after that, then things get a little bit more difficult. But between the two of them, I'm going to give Derek Carr the slight edge. You hear that, Raider fans? Raider fans who've been in my mentions for when I don't pick them to win on a given week. I've heard about. It's funny. This is a completely different aside. I've been lucky enough to do sort of the weekly game picks on NFL.com. I think Daniel Jeremiah and Adam Rank and Cynthia Freeland and several other people are all involved. There are people out there who honestly are tracking my picks more closely than I am, because I hear about it when I pick the same team to lose several weeks in a row. People will screenshot them and come back at me, and I'm like, bro, I don't even remember what I picked 2 weeks ago, but good for you. So for all you Raider fans who are salty at me for not picking the Raiders enough, I'm picking Derek Carr this week. So there, leave me alone. More quarterback talk. Lamar Jackson has notoriously been sort of underperforming this year in Baltimore. But look, the Patriots, that defense, we keep saying it's not the same group that it was. They struggled to contain Joe Flacco last week. So Is this a bounce back opportunity for Lamar Jackson here?
Yeah, I have no idea where Joe Flacco came from. He looked like his old Ravens Joe Flacco, but I'd still, the Patriots on the year are still allowing the third fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks. I think it's a week where, like, if you have Lamar, you're probably still starting him because I like him more than the waiver wire options, but I don't feel great about Lamar. Like, he's barely a top 12 quarterback for me this week, and part of it is the matchup, but most of it is just the way Lamar's playing right now. Like, he's not running nearly as much as he did last year. He's averaging less than 60 rushing yards per game, and I know for a quarterback, over 50 rushing yards is still really good. Not when you drafted someone who was rushing for 80 rushing yards last year and you were expecting similar results. And that's not just the only play. Like, he's throwing 20 less passing yards per game. He had 36 passing touchdowns last year. He is just 12 right now. This offense, and last week, their offense looked more broken than ever. So I don't know. I mean, 2 weeks ago before the bye. So I don't know how you really feel great about Lamar this week.
I'm trying to make myself feel great about Lamar. It is the passing part of it that has sort of befuddled me, because the talk in the offseason and my belief coming into this season was that they wanted to try to throw the football more, and it just hasn't worked out. The connection with Marquise Brown has not worked out. Mark Andrews has been sort of inconsistent, and we'll talk about him a little bit later on in this show as well. It just has not worked out throwing the football. And then, as you mentioned, the rushing yards have not been there. And nobody expected that he was going to set another rushing record after having 1,200 yards last year. But you did expect that he would still get you a little bit more than what we have seen from him this season. We're still waiting for he's had 100-yard game. We're still hoping that maybe there's another one in the offing. It just hasn't happened. But I'm sort of banking on the fact that, look, the Patriots couldn't get pressure on Joe Flacco, and he stood back there and threw 3 touchdown passes. He put up 20 fantasy points last week. So that if Flacco can do that against the Patriots, that I would expect as much or more against Lamar Jackson. So that's sort of what I'm banking on. We'll see. We'll see if it happens. I think at this point, though, you drafted Lamar Jackson high. I won't say you're forced to start him, because that's never going to be the case. But I do think that you're looking around at your options and you're wondering if there's a better one, and you might be hard-pressed to find one, certainly on the waiver wire this week. I generally avoid doing 2 questions about the same team, but the Ravens were on my mind this week, especially with talk that Mark Ingram might be back in the lineup. I know earlier in the week he practiced. On Thursday he did not, so we're still sort of trying to figure out what his situation is. But if it goes back to that 3-headed running attack, do you peg any of these guys, or do you just stay away in general?
I would stay away in general if Mark Ingram is healthy. If he's not, I think these 2 guys are then flex options, because they still take away from one another. But we saw it for weeks when Ingram was healthy. When they have all 3 backs, they're going to use all 3 backs, and each of them plays around a third of the snaps each week. One will get a little bit of a higher amount, like 40% maybe, but it varies week to week, and they all get single-digit carries. Like, yeah, J.K. Dobbins, he may get the targets, but targets from Lamar Jackson to a running back are like 2 per game, so you can't rely on those. The goal line work lately has been going to Gus Edwards, but when they were all healthy, we saw Mark Ingram involved, we saw Dobbins getting some, so it is just a complete nightmare right now, and who would have thought that, right? Like, after last season and how good this running game was with Lamar and Ingram and even Gus Edwards, like, I would have thought maybe J.K. Dobbins doesn't get involved because Ingram is playing really well, but I never would have guessed that, like, you wouldn't be able to start really anyone on Baltimore besides Lamar Jackson.
It's one of those things, and look, obviously we aren't at the practices. We don't see what goes on there. We're not in the meeting rooms. And the bottom line is the Ravens are 6-2, and they're still, very much in the hunt, to be. They're still a Super Bowl contender without a doubt. You do wonder, though, for those running backs, how much of their struggle to produce is from the fact that they are rotating so continually. I mean, I remember looking at their usage rates after week 5 or 6, something like that, and it was split almost completely evenly. I mean, it was like, 34, 33, 33 or something like that. I mean, in terms of their usage rates. And I mean, it's sort of impressive that they could split the opportunities quite so evenly between the 3 of them. But you do wonder that even if it's just a two-headed attack, you still have the chance to get more into the flow of the game and more into the rhythm. And maybe that has something to do with why these guys have not been as productive as we would like them to be. But again, if you're John Harbaugh, you don't have a lot of motivation to change because your team's winning. You're 6-2, and the offense has been good enough. This is just us sort of crying and complaining from our own selfish purposes here, and wishing that we could just sort of pick a guy, because that would be nice. That would be so much better for everything we want to do. Speaking of picking things, you should pick watching us on NFL Fantasy Game Day on Sunday mornings. It's myself along with Michael F. Florio, Kimmy Checks, and Adam Rank driving the proceedings. You can find it in all the places you stream all of our content. That's NFL.com, the NFL apps, and at YouTube, and at youtube.com/NFL Fantasy Football. In fact, if you are watching it on YouTube, you know that Michael F. Florio is there answering your questions for about the first 45 minutes of the show. So if you got last-minute lineup decisions you need help with, jump on, ask the questions, and Florio will try to get to as many of them as he can in the comments section below. We'll step away for a moment, come back, and we will give you our best fantasy daily value picks. Those words all in some sort of order. We'll tell you the guys that you can put into your daily lineup and get the most bang for your fantasy bucks. Stick around for more of the NFL Fantasy Football Show presented by DraftKings. Time for Best Value presented by DraftKings, the time of the week where we dig through the DraftKings salaries and try to figure out who could give you the most bang for your buck there. So we'll start at the quarterback spot. Who is on your radar this week, Florio?
Marcus, I'm going to steal a line from you. It may be low-hanging fruit, but it tastes just as good and it's less work, right? So I'm going with Jared Goff against the Seattle Seahawks here. And it's all about the matchup. Seattle allows the most fantasy points, the most passing yards, and the most rushing touchdowns. I know we don't think of Goff as a runner, but we did see him sneak a rushing touchdown earlier this year, so maybe he can do that. And what I like even more is just the consistency of how many points they allow. There's been two quarterbacks all year who failed to score 20 points against Seattle. One is Kirk Cousins, which I can't explain, and one was Jimmy G when he left early due to injury, and Nick Mullins scored 18 in relief that game. So it's just, right now, start quarterbacks against Seattle.
Kirk Cousins, which I can't explain, is as good a description as any I think I've heard. I'm going to go with Tua Tagovailoa, who looked really good last week against the Cardinals and has a very favorable matchup this week against the Chargers. It is apparent why the Dolphins wanted him and why they put him in when they did. And I know we sort of asked the question a couple of weeks ago why they would make the change from Ryan Fitzpatrick, but I think we've seen it the last couple of weeks. On top of that, this Chargers secondary, I mean, losing Derwin James was a big blow to this group, and I think you've seen that bear out through the season. So I would take my shot with Tua and see what the young guy can do against that Charger defense. Running back, which if there's ever a week to find value at running back, this might be it. Where are you going?
I went a little bit higher, but I'm going with Antonio Gibson. I really like Gibson this week. I think he can be a top 10, maybe even top 5 running back because the Detroit Lions are allowing the most fantasy points per game to running backs. And I know the fear is J.D. McKissic because he's been awesome and getting a lot of passing game work. And I like McKissic too, but my hope here is that with the Lions offense being as banged up as it is, no Kenny Golladay, it's looking like potentially no TJ Hawkinson, that if the Washington football team can rely on their defense and running game in the second half, it could lead to a lot of Antonio Gibson.
I like Gibson, especially because he's getting a lot of the work down near the goal line, which is key. I am going to go, though, with his teammate, J.D. McKissic, and you mentioned that you sort of like as well. So while Gibson's getting the goal line work, McKissic's getting a lot of passing work. And it's weird to think, but he's second on the team in targets, receptions, and receiving yards. I mean, there's, mind you, a huge gap between J.D. McKissic and Terry McLaurin, but he is still getting those opportunities. So he's out there on the field. I like both of these Washington backs against a Detroit team that has given up the most total touchdowns to running backs this year. I think it's 10 on the ground and 5 through the air. So whichever way you're getting down near the end zone, there's a pretty good chance that your running backs will have a chance to score against the Lions. So McKissic is one. He's maybe a little bit more of a long shot than Gibson, but I think has a chance still to produce this week. Over to wide receiver. I love your wide receiver pick for this week, by the way.
Thank you. I'm going with Brandon Cooks, and I was a huge Will Fuller supporter coming into the year, and I still am. I have Will Fuller in a lot of leagues. He's been awesome, but I feel like, is taking away some of the shine from Brandon Cooks, because Brandon Cooks is just going out and balling each and every week. In the last 4 games, he has at least 9 targets in every single one of them. He has scored 30, 21.8, 13, and 17 fantasy points in that stretch. He has a touchdown in 3 of the last 4. And the Browns are a really good matchup for wide receivers. They've allowed the 5th most points to wide receivers this year. And if David Johnson's out, maybe we get a little bit more Deshaun Watson throwing the ball.
Yeah, Brandon Cooks is on pace for another 1,000-yard season, which is sort of amazing considering it seems like nobody ever wants the guy, right? He seems to get traded every year or two, but all he does is go out and, he'll catch, 80 balls and get you 1,000 yards. I think that's a pretty good commodity to have. I'm going to go with John Brown here in this one, and I know that the passing game for the Bills has been sort of sporadic. It certainly kind of bounced back a little bit last week, and I know that when they do throw the ball, it tends to be Stephon Diggs, but I think Brown is set for a big blow-up game this week for the Buffalo Bills. Look, he was a nice piece last year in this offense. He hasn't quite duplicated that level of production this year, part of it because he just has not been completely healthy. But the Cardinals have given up some yards through the air, and we saw that last week against the Dolphins. We saw Preston Williams having a really nice game before, unfortunately, he was injured. And even after he went out, Devontae Parker still caught a few passes from Tua. So I think there's a chance for both of the Bills wide receivers to get involved in this one, and Brown just happens to be the better value of the guys catching the ball in that offense. Tight ends, which we all need tight end help. So please, where are we going for value tight ends this week?
Yeah, I went a little bit higher because tight end, it dries up real fast. So I'm going Evan Ingram here. And what I just love about him is the volume he gets right now each and every week. Like in his last 3 games, he has 29 targets. That's 9, 10, and 10. So it's consistent, big-time volume. And in that stretch, he scored double-digit fantasy points in each game. His points continue to climb. And I know last time he played the Eagles, we on this podcast, Marcus, were talking about how much he disappointed. He only had he had 10.9 fantasy points, but he had a lot more opportunity to do more with it. He had that big long drop that if he catches that, his day looks so much better in that game. And he caught that ball last week, so I'm just feeling good about Evan Ingram going forward right now.
I'm feeling good about Evan Ingram for the rest of the season. I mean, hopefully he can kind of cut out some of the drops, but the schedule opens up nicely for him. I'm going to go Eric Ebron here because the matchup against the Bengals is a good one. They give up the 2nd most fantasy points per game to the tight end position. The pass catchers have been sort of hard to figure. It's nice to see Juju sort of come back. I mean, Chase Claypool's been okay. Deontay Johnson's been okay. You haven't had a ton of blow-up games recently from this group, but I do think Ebron has an opportunity to get a few targets here. And look, unless you have Travis Kelce and he's on a bye this week, you are sort of hoping that your tight end finds the end zone in order to be successful in any given week. And I think Eric Ebron has that opportunity against Cincinnati to find his way into the painted area. So I'm willing to sort of throw a dart at him at the tight end spot. Defenses, we are sort of one mind when it comes to defenses this week. Tell me why you picked the defense we picked.
I'm guessing we had similar approaches. We were like, oh, the Jets are on bye. Okay, who are the Giants playing? That is the defense I'm going to go with. I mean, Daniel Jones has been having a lot of issues holding on to the ball. The Giants are turning the ball over a bunch. They give up a lot of sacks too, and they don't score a lot of points either. The 2nd fewest points, only the Jets are scoring fewer than them right now. So I know it's not the deepest of dive at defense, but if I'm building a DFS lineup this week, I'm getting the Eagles in.
Well, Daniel Jones didn't turn the ball over for the first time all season last week. I am hard-pressed to believe that he's going to make that 2 in a row. So that's part of the reason I'm going with the Eagles defense. The Giants have just been very friendly to opposing fantasy defenses. And, in a week where I didn't think there were a lot of great values defensively for daily fantasy, I thought that this was one of the best ones. And look, I've been suggesting for the last couple of weeks that this is a chance to stream the Eagles defense. I don't want to say I was alone. I know there were other people saying it as well, but I definitely advocated that this was a time to go out, pick up the Eagles defense, stream them because they had some really favorable matchups coming up, and this was one of them. So there you go. That was Best Value presented by DraftKings. When we come back, going to take a look at Mark Andrews and how we feel about him and what has been sort of an up and down season there in Baltimore. Stay tuned for more of the NFL Fantasy Football Show. It's time for Best of the Pack, presented by Panini Trading Cards. If you've been watching the show all year, you know that this is when we pick out a pack of Panini Trading Cards, and we pick 3 of them, and we talk about some of the best ones in the pack. So let's start it off at tight end, which has been a bugaboo all year long, Mark Andrews. And it's funny, I went and looked, and he was coming into Week 10, was the tight end 8. And it was sort of amazing to me that he was that high. And I went and I looked, and when he has been good, he has been very good. He's had 3 games with 17 or more points. The rest of them have been 6 or fewer. I mean, it is all or nothing with him. This week against the Patriots, how much do you trust Mark Andrews?
I, for the first time all year, Marcus, do not have Mark Andrews as a top 12 tight end. It's gotten that bad. Like, to your point is everything I was going to say about him. Like, when he does show out, he's been good, but there's just been way more duds than there have been those big performances. And what worries me is in the last 3 weeks, with all 6 points or fewer, like you said, 4 targets, 6 targets, 5 targets. He has 1 game with more than 6 targets in his last 5 games played. This offense, it's not Mark Andrews either. It's the Lamar part of the passing. It's just this whole offense in general. It's not clicking right now. The Patriots have been stingy against tight ends. If you're starting him, I think you're hoping that the Mark Andrews of 2019 shows up.
He had 58 receiving yards in Week 1, 58 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. We were all like, hey, all right, Mark Andrews, he's still one of the elite tight ends in fantasy football. That 58 yards is his high for the season. He has not hit 60 receiving yards yet in a game. And at this point, yeah, I'm sort of out on it. I mean, he has become sort of like any number of other tight ends that unless he finds his way into the end zone, there's just not enough there to give you consistent quality production. And, you know, we talked about kind of avoiding the Colts passing game. I mean, we're at a point where I think you probably avoid the Ravens passing game too, because there's just nobody there that you can have any real belief in on any given week. All right, next up. It is Ronald Jones of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And look, his lot in life has sort of gone in circles, right? He was in a committee, then Fournette got hurt, and he was the man. Then Fournette comes back, and he's back in a committee again. Do you consider him still to be the RB1 in Tampa right now?
I do not. I think that Leonard Fournette is the RB1. I have Leonard Fournette ranked higher. I'm excited to play Leonard Fournette this week. Not so much Ronald Jones. I still have him pretty high because of the matchup, and the Panthers give up a lot of points on the ground. But since Fournette has been back and healthy, he's playing 2/3 of the snaps. Jones is just playing 30%. He's getting a lot of the targets, 6 targets per game Fournette's averaging there. Jones is just down to 3. They're splitting a lot of the groundwork. And to take it a step further, Marcus, like, let's look at everything Bruce Arians has done, not said, because I know he keeps saying it's Ronald Jones' job. He inherited Ronald Jones and did not really use him as the lead back last year. Instead was getting Dare Ogunbowale and Peyton Barber into the mix. And then this year, in a year they clearly went all in, they drafted Keyshawn Vaughn in the 3rd round. They signed Leonard Fournette before the season. And when he has Leonard Fournette available, he uses Leonard Fournette over Ronald Jones. So Bruce Arians can say he loves Ronald Jones all he wants. His actions clearly paint a different picture.
I hate that you're right. I really do. I hate that you're right about this because I want it so bad for Rojo. And there was
He's
like
good.
a stretch. There was a stretch of like a month in there where I felt like I was right. Like I came into this year kind of like as one of. I said this before. I said this in August, right? There was no more polarizing player in fantasy football than Ronald Jones, right? If you wanted to start a fight amongst fantasy analysts, you would just say Ronald Jones and walk out of the room and just let them fight amongst themselves. And so for like a month, I was feeling really good about it. And you're right. Everything that the Bucs have done, all of their actions suggest that they don't necessarily love Rojo that way. That they're going to give everybody else sort of a chance to come in and take that job from him. And, it's frustrating because right now, as we sit here and talk, Ronald Jones is a top 15 fantasy back, but everybody else is still going to get opportunities. The other weird part about this is that if after the first 3 years of Leonard Fournette's career, you would have come to me and told me that Leonard Fournette would go somewhere and become a team's pass catching back, I would have laughed in your face. But this is where we are. He goes to Tampa. Well, he catches 70 balls last year in Jacksonville. He goes to Tampa this year, and he is the guy that they throw the football to out of the backfield.
He's the new James White.
2020 is weird, man. It absolutely is weird. All right, last one. It's A.J. Brown, who played last night and did not have a great night last night. Just one catch for 21 yards, and that was kind of it. Dropped a pass that might have been a touchdown down the sidelines early in that game, but just not much to show for it. But on the whole, it has been a very good and productive year for A.J. Brown. So let's kind of spin it forward a little bit. Just projecting to next year's drafts, how high would you consider drafting him?
Yeah, as someone who has A.J. Brown in my league of record, watching him play last night and having multiple opportunities to reel in that ball and not able to do it, it hurt. But as someone who has A.J. Brown, I think his production has been great. Like, I'm not going to complain about it at all, but his volume isn't quite, and that was my concern with Brown coming into the year. He does not have a game with double-digit targets this year. Corey Davis has multiple of those. So, like, it's not like that it's because they're just running the ball the whole time. Like, Brown is giving you the most out of the limited production he's been seeing, but it's just this offense. They spread the ball out. They love to run the ball. And I think third round is where I would be comfortable taking him, preferably earlier third round, because that's where I think like those borderline wide receiver ones really start to go. And I think that is the range that I have him in. But I will say I fully expect, because the fantasy community loves this guy, I fully expect for him to get a lot of hype and potentially go in the second round next year.
That's what I think is going to end up happening. I think you're right. I think we'd all feel better with him in the third round, but I do think the hype is going to sort of push him up a little bit. What is different this year versus last year, and you sort of talked about it, is Corey Davis playing well, Jonnu Smith sort of playing well as well. I mean, last year, the Titans didn't have a ton of consistent options to go to in the passing game. So I think that's part of the reason A.J. Brown got as many opportunities as he did. But even then, I think one of the things people loved about him was the fact that he was incredibly efficient on a relatively few number of targets compared to some other guys that were scoring the same amount of fantasy points as he was. And maybe that should have been sort of a warning sign for some of us too, that that really high rate of efficiency was going to be hard to duplicate. So he's been good. I don't know that he has quite been the guy that he was last year, but I don't think you're going to just suddenly kick him to the curb. But you're right. We talk about this now, we say third round now, and then we get to like June and everybody's like super hyped about A.J. Brown again, and that ADP starts going through the roof. So consider this our opportunity to our efforts to tamp that down a little bit and help you get some kind of draft value at A.J. Brown before you get to next August. All right, that was Best of the Pack presented by Panini Trading Cards. We'll come back and we will ask a question of our resident nerd about tight end scoring since the turn of the millennium. Stay tuned for more of the NFL Fantasy Football Show. All right, it is time for my favorite segment of the week. It is Ask a Nerd. And again, shout out to Matt Okada, who sat in on Wednesday, did a great job holding it down in place of Adam Rank. But we have been doing a series of the best positional single game performances since the year 2000. And let's just round it on out. We asked Matt Okada this week about the best single game tight end fantasy performances since the year 2000. What you got, Matt?
Thanks, Marcus, and welcome back to Ask a Nerd. After our QB segment last week, Kyler Murray put up 38 fantasy points, so I'd say the streak of success continues. And this week, we are tackling the one position we're all desperate for help at. Here are the top 5 single-game performances by a tight end this millennium. At number 5, we have the fresh memory of George Kittle in Week 4 this season. Kittle had 15 catches for 183 yards and a touchdown to finish with 40.1 fantasy points, mostly in good old garbage time. It's a very similar story at number 4, where Zach Ertz racked up 40.5 fantasy points on 14 catches and 145 yards with 2 scores in Week 10, 2018. Another garbage time Eagles game, only reversed. No tight end list would be complete without the Gronk, and he spikes his way to number 3 on our list by spiking 3 touchdowns in Week 8, 2014. Gronk had 9 catches for 149 yards in that game against the Bears, but it was that trio of scores that pushed him up to 41.9 fantasy points and onto our list. For number 2, we take a trip back in time to another tight end with a 3 TD game. Antonio Gates scored 42.5 fantasy points in Week 8, 2005, thanks to 10 catches for 145 yards and those 3 scores. The future Hall of Famer ranks 3rd all-time in fantasy points by a tight end, behind only Tony Gonzalez and Jason Witten. And finally, at number 1 on our list, we have a tight end legend and now a TV star, Shannon Sharpe. In Week 7, 2002, Sharpe caught 12 balls for a tight end record 214 receiving yards and 2 tutties, en route to an incredible 45.5 fantasy points. How I long for Mark Andrews or Hunter Henry to put up one of these weeks. Let's hope together! Until next time, I'm Matt Okada, this has been Ask a Nerd, and may the fantasy points be with you.
Thank you, Matt. It was a good mix of tight ends that we saw in that block there. Just kind of, some old, some new. And so, all right. Usually we get to this part of the show. I've asked, which tight end you would want since 2000, but I feel like there's only really one answer to that. If it's not Gronk, I just don't know who it's going to be. And then I ask, which tight end do we think could maybe join the list? But I don't feel confident that there's a solid answer this week with Travis Kelce on a bye and George Kittle injured. So instead, I'm just going to ask you at this point, what do we do about tight end draft strategy? I mean, if we're starting to think about next year and we're drafting a tight end, what approach do you suggest people take?
My approach for a stretch was just to draft Antonio Gates at tight end, so that was fun seeing him in that. But I think my approach next year is going to be the opposite of what it was this year. This year I was saying if I can get Kelce or Kittle, end of round 2, I will take them. And then if I missed out on those guys, I would wait and I would try to grab a tight end that I perceive as having the upside to kind of take that next step. And Evan Ingram or Tyler Higbee was one that I was very high on. And where I drafted those players outside of Evan Ingram now, but like early on, I was still streaming tight end week to week. So I think my approach next season is going to be Kelce, Kittle, and I'll put Waller in that bunch early and really prioritize the position early, or just wait until like the double-digit rounds and I'll end up streaming the position anyway. But that's what I'm doing when I wait till the middle rounds to take a tight end anyway.
That was sort of my strategy this year too, that if I would either get one of those top 2 guys early or I would just wait until the double-digit rounds. And that might just have to be it again, because those middle round guys have been incredibly frustrating, whether it has been, Hunter Henry, Evan Ingram, you take your pick at those. It just hasn't really worked out. So I think there is actual value in going and getting someone early. So I'll ask you this though, because of what we have seen sort of in the middle to late round guys, the fact that George Kittle has not been healthy for a good stretch of the year, would you be surprised to see Travis Kelce jump into the first round in a lot of leagues?
I wouldn't. And I, for the first time ever, I think I may not shy away from it. I'm still someone that believes you need to get your running backs early just because those workhorse running backs dry up really fast. But my approach this year was wide receiver is so deep, especially in like rounds 3 through 7, that I'm okay waiting and getting my starting wide receivers there. And then it just got deeper as the season went on. Like there's so many great waiver wire wide receiver pickups this year that I would not be surprised if we see tight ends going ahead of a lot of these wide receivers just because the scarcity at the running back and tight end position compared to how deep wide receiver is.
Yeah, I do think Kelce is going to be very coveted. I think you're going to see him go really early. I think Kittle still goes early. Darren Waller may end up going early, but beyond that, I think you're just going to be better off sort of waiting. And yeah, if there's a position you can absolutely wait on, it is probably wide receiver, just because there are so many guys who are so productive at that level. One day tight end will be deep, or at least we'll stop telling ourselves that tight end is going to be deep, and we just accept that this is currently our
which will happen first. It'll get good, or we'll stop trying to make it good.
I think what will happen is that we'll stop trying to make it good, and then it will become good. That's how it's going to work out. And when we stop beating our heads against that wall, then actually the door will open up and we'll have some fantasy tight ends. So, all right, there it is. That is it. We are done. We appreciate you hanging out with the NFL Fantasy Football Show presented by DraftKings. You know the drill. Tell two friends to tell two friends. Rate, review, and remember, you'll never be as lazy as the person who named the fireplace. Be safe, take care of yourselves, wear a mask, and we will see you on Monday.